Hello, my name is TArik Kirkendoll, and this is my, oh wait, one more. This is my module 1 Excel report. For the first question, we talked about sneakers sold at a sneaker company. And it was about the profit of a company that produces discount sneakers. It's not loading the little line thing. The model is supposed to show a line that goes through all of these marks. And the company's initial investment was $250, which is why it immediately went down or started lower. And then that was used to start the company. This is why it's at a negative 240, but it quickly rose back up all the way or the lowest it ever got to was 300, and then it quickly shot back up, eventually making it all the way to $500. For question number 2, this was about the possibility of a die being rolled. And these are 4 possibilities that could happen. In the first probability table, which is over here, you see that it was asking the probability of getting an even number. This had the most likely chance of happening because it's basically half. And then over here, at the possibility of landing a 12, just the number 12. This has the lowest possibility because it's 4 out of 36. Expenses, and these are all his calculated expenses he pays every month, like gas, car, utility. I added them all together and then subtracted them by his total monthly income to get the difference, or what would later be his miscellaneous cost. So his miscellaneous cost, when I put it into a pie chart, was the largest portion of the pie chart. I assume that was because this could include anything from hospital bills to food and other luxuries. And that is my module 1 Excel report. We talked the American attitude towards the changing weather. And then in early spring 2010, the general American public's attitude was more evenly divided. More people did say yes, and there were still 10% that said no. That remained kind of consistent. However, by the fall of 2015, they became a lot more polarized. 71% said yes, whereas 17% said no. When you look at the pie charts, you can see this ratio of them being more or less half, and then this much greater portion being the 71%. I assume that this could be due to the fact that in that span of years, well, every year in the US, more people have access to internet and technology, so it becomes more common knowledge. For question number 2, we were calculating the heights. Or no, this is data collected from the heights of people. Or no, these are data collected from people who miss classes. So this is Helena's missed classes and Juanita's missed classes. These lines are the tread lines, which kind of show like their main area of where they missed. Helena, it seems, missed a more consistent amount in her classes and were on average higher than that of Juanita's, although they both seem to miss quite a bit. You could argue that the standard deviation is much greater on Juanita's, which is kind of why hers is so scattered. That trend line isn't most helpful because her data doesn't really have an organized path, whereas Helena's does, at least compared to Juanita's. Now, in the heights of Army recruits in inches, you find that their heights are much more consistent and regimented, and it's probably because there are height requirements, like you have to be at least a certain height to get in. So it's going to be rather consistent, and we can assume that all these are adults. Whereas with the heights of mall shoppers range, there's no requirements, and a lot of them could be children, which they could skew the data, which is the reason why there's a lot more standard deviation. The trend line in the heights of the Army recruits is much more consistent. When you look at the box and whisker plots, you see that there are much more outliers with the mall shoppers, which is why the line is much longer here. For question number 3, we talked about psychology class subjects. And in a class, they did a study, and I was supposed to represent this in a box on my whisker plot. It reflects the data displayed in the table. The mean of the box and the whisker plot determines who has the most scores, or like what is the most common score. And the outliers are the ones who skew that shape. The greater the outlier, the more the shape tends to be warped. So if this were to continue being pushed this way, this number would also increase. However, the median would not really like change as long as the amount of numbers in this table stays the same. And I also calculated the standard deviation or the quartile ranges of this. So at the very top, you have the most common. This is 34%, 34%. So you have around 68% of the class is right here, and then the outliers are further. So the people who did really poorly are the people who did really well. On question number 4, we talk about the United States and South American dams and how the U.S. had more, but they were all not roughly, but they were closer in size in terms of yards, in terms of square footage, or in terms of yards. And here you see that we have a smaller range than that of South America because, well, also South America is an entire continent, whereas we're just one country. But South America has only 6 dams, but they are on average larger than ours. You can tell by the mean. Oh, wait, no. Yeah, they're much larger average-wise. And there's more diversity in terms of size. So because they have one that's almost the size of one of our own, but their largest one is much bigger than ours. In these box and whisker plots, you can see the coefficient variables and how they're more tightly compacted in the United States one because they're much closer in size and the average is more consistent, whereas in the South American one, they are much more spread out. Now on to number 5. In number 5, we were supposed to compare the cost of items with 45% off or a 10% off the entire purchase. So with the 45% off, it seemed reasonable to do the most expensive thing there first, or like put the 45% discount on the most expensive item, which was that very expensive sweater, which got it down to $52. Ultimately, the most cost-effective one to do is the 45% off a single item rather than 10% off the entire purchase. In this graph, it also represents this, like how much you would save or how much you spent on each item, and what stayed relatively small was the orange, which would be this. In question number 2, we're talking about the home that Gwen bought for $121,000. She had to finance $9,000 with a 10-year mortgage. She had to pay about $1,887 per month. In total, Gwen ended up paying over $1,400,000. To find the interest, I subtracted the amount financed from the total paid, which is $53,440. In this amount of time, I had to also calculate the number of months in terms of the 10 years, so 12 times 10. And this is her interest paid, which I subtracted from the total paid. In this graph, you also see that overall, her total paid is much higher, but this interest paid did end up paying quite a bit. She ended up paying more than the actual house was because of how quickly the interest was progressing, which is rather common. Question number 3 of module 5. We have a scenario where someone has an annual pay of $35,900, and their take-home or leftover money is $28,720. But after an annual raise from 20%, or an annual raise from their $35,000, they went up to $37,700. However, this didn't work out in their favor because they ended up with a higher deductible because they went up the tax bracket. In these pie charts, you see what portion went to the deductible, and you can see that this one's this angle, or this Pac-Man figure-esque, has a much more acute, and this one's much more right angle, more like a right angle. So they ultimately, despite getting a raise, they ended up losing $68 that year. So the raise wasn't the best. It wasn't big enough, I suppose. In question number 4, I talked about the compound interest compared to simple interest, and how they grow at different rates. Even though they're both like a interest rate, so they're both going to grow over time, one escalates much more quickly, and that is the compound one. And that's like, in this example it happened, that's also very common in other examples, because whereas simple interest really only typically depends on the initial deposit as well as small, like steady payments, there's a higher frequency with the compounded interest payments. In this particular one, we see that the difference between these two remained rather large, and it also escalated much higher, from 80 to 360, whereas with a simple interest it was 78 to only 168. On question number 5 of module 5, we have a scenario where someone buys a house that was on sale for $400,000, because the initial payment was $32,000, you still have to pay an interest rate of 5%. This 5% rate led up to them paying $214,000, or to over $214,000 in interest. When you calculate the difference between the initial cost and the total cost, the buyer had to spend over $100,000 more in just interest alone, which again is saying that buying houses is expensive, not just because of the price of the house, but mainly because of the interest. I briefly did the subsidized one and unsubsidized, but I really just wrote down information, so thank you. And this is the end of my presentation.